map on the back if you get bored. Draw little stick figures of Ruth and Boaz. Ruth sleeping at Boaz's feet. Feel free. But we are in the book of Ruth. And what a precious book this is. There's so much here that speaks of humility and it speaks of the goodness of God, but also just people being so humble. We'll see in a second, but this is a very precious book, a nice cleanser after the book of Judges. But again, let me pray and offer the time to the Lord. Heavenly Father, we bring the offering of ourselves. What greater thing can we bring except our hearts on the altar, that you might receive it, that you might mold it and shape it, that you might take it, Lord, and then do what you will with it. And we know that what you want to do is good. You want to make us more like you. You want us to be about your business. So we graciously, I hope, and freely offer up ourselves to you at this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, Ruth chapter 2, and we kind of get to the meat of the text here in the narrative. There is a little bit more in terms of conflict in Ruth chapter 4, but Ruth 3 is so much of grace and sweetness, and we'll get to that in just a moment. To jump right into the text, we ended almost at the end of Ruth chapter 2. I didn't finish it all out because it serves as a little bit of a quick way to remind ourselves of what has happened. Ruth chapter 2, verse 17, Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. That is after after she ate with Boaz. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by Yahweh, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth relates the events that we talked about last week back to Naomi. And to just piggyback on some of the comments we spoke about last week, if it is true that Naomi was a little embittered and cynical as she came to Bethlehem at the end of chapter 1, the events that took place with Ruth and her gleaning in the fields of Boaz restored her hope and faith in Yahweh. At first mention, verse 19, Naomi is simply thankful and blesses whatever stranger showed kindness to her daughter-in-law. But at the mention of Boaz's name, she speaks Yahweh's blessing on Boaz as she realizes he's not only providing food for Ruth and Naomi, but he is showing chesed, faithful kindness to the dead. What's interesting, if you kind of track, I actually just noticed this while I was reading it, but the text is very clear to say that when Naomi refers to Boaz in verse 20 as a close relative, one of our redeemers, the text makes a special emphasis. And Ruth the Moabite said, in other words, to point out that Ruth is someone who is outside of the people of Israel, and yet this close relative of ours, one of our redeemers, Naomi is including Ruth. No, you're part of this family now. Ruth the Moabite, you're part of this family, and you can be redeemed by someone in this family. And not only that, I also noticed that it says the daughter-in-law, the daughter-in-law, the daughter-in-law. But what does Naomi call Ruth in verse 22? "It is good, my daughter." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter." And just again, a little window, a little way to indicate that the narrator's indicating the close relationship that Naomi and Ruth had. Naomi considered Ruth like her family, and family is, of course, one of the themes of this book. I just noticed that just now in reading it. Now, what does it mean, going back to Naomi's response to the revelation that Ruth had been gleaning in Boaz's field, that he is a redeemer and that God has not forsaken or has shown kindness to the living and the dead alike? What does she mean by that? Well, she's referring to her dead husband and her dead sons, whose lineages were broken but not forgotten, because there is a way for the broken household of Naomi to be, in a sense, resurrected. That heritage could be redeemed through Boaz, and it was entirely possible, even though this was, as far as like a ancient Near Eastern woman was concerned, to lose your husband and your sons was the harshest sorrow and tragedy that a person could endure. And it was a very tragic situation, but it was redeemable because of Boaz. God had not failed to show chesed, kindness, to the living and the dead. What does it mean to be a redeemer in this context? The Hebrew word is goel, and the root of this word means to redeem or buy back. Now, here I'm going to use just a quick breakdown from a commentator who gives us 5 different ways that a redeemer could redeem or buy back a person in their family. Some of them are more relevant than others. You don't necessarily need to turn there if you don't want to, but you can write this down. The first, or one of the responsibilities that a redeemer could have, is avenging the death of a murdered relative. And so if you go to Numbers 35:19, this is one way that you could refer to someone as a redeemer. Numbers 35:19. The avenger of blood, if someone basically murders another person, the avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. So this idea of being an avenger or redeemer here, or a redeemer avenger, is to bring the judgment or the consequence of that murder upon a person for the sake of someone in your family that was killed. So that's one way you could fulfill a responsibility as a redeemer. Another way is detailed in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. And this is more relevant to our situation here. Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10. Here's another way a person could be a redeemer. Deuteronomy 25:5. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house, and the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. I mean, that is a weird context, it's kind of unfamiliar, but it's basically an honor or duty that a man would have a brother, unmarried brother, to marry his brother's wife, to perpetuate that name. They'd be, in a way, perpetuating both of their names, but that was a way that someone could redeem a family member, as well as in the context of a deceased husband, which is similar to the situation happening here in Ruth. On other ways is buying back family land that had been sold, Leviticus 25:25, buying a family member who had been sold as a slave, Leviticus 25:47 through 49, and looking after needy and helpless members of the family, Leviticus 25:35. So Leviticus 25 is all about kind of helping out the poor. And if you as an Israelite were in such a circumstance that you were so poor that you had to sell yourself into slavery, or you had to sell your land, one of your kinsmen could come and buy that land back for you. And that would be a function of a redeemer. And presumably that redeemer would buy it and give it back to you. looking out for a needy or helpless member of the family. Leviticus 25:35, that one, of course, could refer to Ruth's situation as well. This might not be some exhaustive list of ways you could redeem a family member. The general idea is that when bad things happen, family should take care of you, closest family first. That's generally how Israel operated, because after all, what is Israel? It is a nation made up of family. They're all descended from 12 brothers, and so the idea is generally when things come up, family takes care of it. Now, I wouldn't necessarily adopt this as to any other nation except a theocratic nation where your citizenship is basically blood relationship. On the other hand, I think there's something for the fact that family should take care of family. In the New Testament, you see a similar idea, that the church should take care of its own. There's also a precedent that if you have someone in need, before they ask benevolence from the church, they should see if a family member can take care of the situation first. So the idea of family helping to take care of family, just in general, is kind of the principle, and you see some specific ways that worked out. Now, how often did this happen in Israel? Maybe not that often. I mean, Israel failed in a lot of regards as far as keeping the commandments of God were concerned. But we can at least, I think, wrap our minds around the idea that in a nation where everybody is family and related, your family would take care of you. You didn't necessarily need the government to step in on that. Now, we can tell in Ruth chapter 2, when she brings up that Boaz is a close relative, one of our redeemers, that there's an idea percolating in her mind. We know where her thoughts are going because we've read the book, but Ruth seems kind of oblivious, because right after she mentions him being one of the redeemers, Ruth just keeps going on talking about how Boaz said you can keep working in the fields and gleaning them. Now, Naomi encourages her to stay in Boaz's fields and says, it's good, you go out with the young women, lest in another field you be assaulted, and she makes it sound like this is a safety issue. But she also has an ulterior motive in encouraging her daughter to continue to work in those fields, and the text ends, she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So the harvest was a couple months long, from about April to May, maybe early June. It was the wheat and the barley harvest. So she kept gleaning in these fields for several weeks. If it's true, let me step back. Let me take a step back from that. Going back to Naomi. At the end of chapter 1, if it's true that Naomi was bitter, maybe even angry at God for all the misfortune that had happened to her, I think you can see at the end of chapter 2, she realizes that God hasn't abandoned or forsaken her. And the way that she was encouraged, or maybe came out of her bitterness, was in how God was dealing with Ruth. And I think there's something to that. I think there is a lesson or application there. And this is a personal testimony. I'll give you a personal application testimony. There are times when I get down spiritually that I question the Lord and his dealings with me. Why is this happening? What are you doing? And of course, a lot of this is because I get stuck in my own head. I just start thinking about it, lie awake when I'm going out, and I just start wrapping myself up in my thoughts about the situation, about how I'm feeling, looking at my little kingdom and getting upset that things aren't going my way, and feeling sorry for myself, or being offended by things people said or did, or frustrated at the things I said and did. And you get wrapped up in yourself. I do. And one thing that the Lord often uses to get me out of that rut of thinking is seeing what God is doing in the lives of other people. Maybe I might be questioning what God is doing or not doing in my life. Maybe I cannot see it. Maybe I'm just too close to me to see that God is doing something in my heart. Maybe I can even doubt his power being at work. in the situation or circumstance or even my heart. But what I often cannot deny is what I see God doing in the lives of the people around me. And when I see you guys continue to trust the Lord, when I see him working in your life, when I see his faithfulness manifested in your trials, when I hear prayer requests, which I think is why our afternoon service is great, is to hear from the Elflings or something about the trials the burdens they're bearing, and the way God is sustaining them, and the way they're looking to the Lord. That snaps me out of it. I start to realize, you know what? Even if God was doing nothing in me, which is not true, look at what he's doing everywhere else. I mean, can't I just be happy for that? And if God is working in that situation and circumstance, which is way worse than my own, isn't he working in my life? It just gets me out of it that God is, doing something much bigger than I can imagine in and through so many people that I love and care about. Oftentimes, that's what gets me out of a rut. So I can understand here, if it's true that Naomi was really kind of sour and dour about everything is awful, and God is doing all this and that to me there at the end of Ruth 1, seeing, wait a second, Boaz? And he seems to be taking a liking to my daughter-in-law, this Redeemer? I mean, seeing God work was obviously lifting up her soul. Now, again, time passes, a few weeks, maybe several weeks. All the while, Ruth is continuing to glean, and there's a little bit to fill in here between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. I think it's biblically consistent and informed, but I'm going to read a few things into this. But first of all, there is a time frame of weeks going by where Ruth is consistently going out every day, we assume, to Boaz's field. That's not especially speculative. But based on Naomi's suggestion to keep doing this, Naomi at least clearly sees an opportunity for something to happen as these two, like a flint and a rock, keep interacting with each other, that there might be a spark and a flame, right? She's obviously hoping that something might happen or a relationship to blossom. I think I'm reading, that's a little bit of reading into it, but that's, I think, reasonable given what happens next. But, of course, nothing happens. Nothing does happen. We know Boaz is an honorable man. He's not going to force the situation. And Ruth is this humble woman and very self-controlled and worthy woman, the text says. So she's not going to try and force the situation. It's clear they're interested in each other, judging by the conversations that are going to happen. So we know they're interested in each other. So beginning of chapter 3, Naomi gives some advice. They're getting to the end of the harvest and the gleaning and the opportunities. And some might overplay Naomi's matchmaking here. I think it's not so much her matchmaking, it's just, she's just giving a little nudge in the right direction. It's not manipulation. She's not trying to manipulate, Naomi's not trying to manipulate Ruth, and she's not trying to get Ruth to manipulate Boaz. It's nothing like that. It's just, I think she has a sense that all this thing needs is just a little, push in the right direction, and things will happen. So, chapter 3, verse 1, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Isn't that Boaz, our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she, Ruth, replied, "All that you say, I will do." So, how could Ruth express an interest in Boaz that was sufficiently bold, but also not manipulative, not forceful? Naomi's plan, if Ruth was agreeable to it, it's not like she had to do it, was to go to Boaz and lie down at his feet. Now, there's a few things to know about this plan, this whole thing, right? We've got to lay down this scenario a little bit, because these are all like categories and situations and places that we don't really have any kind of regular interaction with. Let's start with the fact that she is to go to the threshing floor. Well, what is that? Well, the process of winnowing grain is you'd find a flat spot on a hill, preferably one that had like a big stone on top of it, and you would crush the grain, and then you would take forks and you would lift the grain up, and since you're on a hilltop, you're hoping that the wind would blow away all of the chaff, like the husks and the seeds, the grain that you want, will fall to the ground. So it's this process where you are lifting up the grain and then letting all the husks blow away, and now you have all this grain on the floor that would be very easy to gather. Now, it's obviously hard work, and Boaz was doing it, participating in it with his workers. Again, we mentioned last time that it seems like he had a good relationship with his workers. He obviously is also willing to put in hard work to actually participate in the winnowing. He's not just someone that tells other people what to do. Now, of course, if you're doing this all day, you had all this grain on top of this hill that you would put into baskets and take away. Now, if you're doing it all day, you're not going to put it into baskets until the next morning. And apparently, it was either customary that Boaz would do this, or maybe this was special because perhaps it was like the last night of the harvest, but apparently, I think this was maybe a regular thing myself, Boaz would, after the winnowing, would enjoy a meal there with the rest of the workers, and he would even sleep there. Like just fall asleep on the threshing floor. Maybe some of that's to make sure no one would steal it. Because obviously, if you have a bunch of grain that's pre-winnowed for you and you leave it there, maybe someone gets the bright idea, well, there's a lot of grain up here. Someone did all the work. I'll just steal it. So it might make sense. But again, it's kind of odd that here's the owner, the master of the field, staying there to pull security. I don't know, he clearly could have assigned someone else to do it. But he seems to be right up there with the rest of his men, willing to put in the same kind of work and effort. And hey, maybe this was the last day of the harvest. Maybe they had a party. You get the sense in a minute that there's eating and drinking, and he was happy, and it was a good time. Maybe that was every night. I mean, maybe he's just a really good boss to work for. Party after a hard day's work, at a party, enjoy a nice meal and hang out afterward. Maybe that was just part of the whole 2-month season of harvest was that. Again, we're not an agricultural society. We don't really know what that feeling is to go out, hard day's work, a harvest, harvesting some crops and come back and just relax, have some good food with everyone else who's working hard out in the sun and just chill. Maybe you fall asleep out there. But hopefully you can imagine a situation kind of like that, okay? You've seen probably enough movies and things to fill that in with your imagination. Now the plan is, with that little bit of background, for Ruth to wash and dress herself nicely, and in the middle of the night, when everyone's asleep, find out where he is, make sure she's observing to not, be at the feet of some other random guy. Make sure you're at Boaz's feet, uncover his feet, and lie down next to it. Now, why uncover the feet? I think it's just so that he would get cold and wake up. So the point of uncovering his feet is so that he would realize that she's sleeping or she's lying down. She's not necessarily sleeping, but that someone is lying down at his feet without being like assertive, like shaking him or doing anything weird, especially if he's on like security duty. If that is the case, if someone shakes you up when you're on security, he might have been confrontational, right? So I think part of this is just pragmatic. And there might be something there about like maybe she was like, keeping his feet warm or something. There's not a whole lot known. If this is like some ritual or practice, there's not a whole lot known about it. I think it's just when your feet are cold, you're going to wake up, okay? And there's going to be this woman lying at your feet. Now, this is not, by the way, anything scandalous or sexual or anything like that. Quite the opposite. It's almost ironic when people try to make it go that way. Like, you already know these are worthy people. They're not doing stuff like that. But actually, by putting herself at his feet, she was demonstrating a heart that's trying not to do anything weird or untoward. She's trying to protect his integrity and her integrity by doing this way. But also, it's kind of interesting that she's by putting herself at his feet, it was asserting her willingness to be like submissive to him, like a wife would, right? It's like aggressive submissiveness, an aggressive demonstration of her willingness to be submissive to Boaz. Does that kind of make sense? Like very forward when you think about it, kind of aggressively to say, would you be my husband? But without saying anything. When Naomi tells Ruth that he will tell you what to do, she means that, he is going to either, take you up on your offer to marry you or he won't, but he is going to understand what this entails and what this means. And you need to go along, go with whatever he says, yes or no, right? But Ruth is willing to go along with his plans. She does know what it means. She agrees with it because she likes Boaz, right? She likes Boaz. She doesn't mind marrying this worthy man that she has met, that has gone out of his way. We talked about it last time, to protect her, care for her, acknowledge her and her faith and her character, to see her love and see all the things about her. Not one mention here, by the way, of what Ruth looks like, or Boaz noticing what she looks like. It's just purely based on the character and the quality of the person. What happens? Well, verse 6, so she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, he wasn't drunk, but he had drunk, alcohol, but not to be drunk because he's a worthy man. And his heart was merry. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Boaz is unsuspecting. It's dark. It's not like they could flip on a light switch or anything like that. Alexa, turn on the light. He realizes, though, what's happening pretty quickly. That this is Ruth, that she is proposing something there at his feet. So let's focus just on the dialogue, starting with Ruth's response. So, of course, after the who are you, I'm Ruth, your servant, and identify. What does Ruth say after that? She says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. To spread your wings over someone, or this could also be a skirt or garment, this was actually the marry your servant, please part. This is the actual kind of, without, again, being assertive, without making a demand or without even using the words, to spread your wings over someone was a way to express your willingness to care for someone, to take care of them in like an official way. You see at least maybe one example of this in Ezekiel 16:8. You can just write that down, but Ezekiel 16:8. This is a reference to God and what he does. Ezekiel 16:8. When I passed by you again, and this is talking about Jerusalem, but personified as like a woman. When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord Yahweh, and you became mine. It is clearly like a man finding a woman who had no one, who was unloved and uncared for, and he commits himself to her, spreads his garment over her, and they get married. That's what the text is saying. So that kind of verbiage to say, spread your wings or your garment over me, is really to say, please marry me. Now, Ruth, again, is being very forward, but in this super humble way. She appeals also not to her own desperation and need, or even necessarily his ego, but to his role as a redeemer. Now, it's not that she doesn't love Boaz. I think she does, and I think Boaz loves her. I mean, it doesn't say that, but I think you're supposed to kind of read that in all these interactions, that this real affection. But Ruth, for her part, she is able to see beyond her own feelings and desires. Now, we are very accustomed to a view of marriage that's largely about our preferences, our emotions, our desires, as a precursor to marriage. In some cultures, even now, but historically in ancient Israel at this time, it was more expected that, they had arranged marriages. And the idea with arranged marriage is that those desires and emotions, they come after the wedding day. The wedding day isn't seen as the culmination of months or years or decades of growing desire and feelings, but the beginning of them. This is where it starts, is wedding and marriage. Now, it's just a different way of looking at it. We're not accustomed to that, but many cultures, they have essentially like an arranged marriage idea, and the idea is you'd marry someone and then you'd learn to love them and grow in your feelings and emotions and desires. We're just very used to, you get what you want. I want exactly what I want, and I can pick from all the people and get exactly what I want, and then what happens? Divorce rates, is that super great? I don't know. Well, you got what you want, didn't you? Well, do you know what you need? That's a whole nother subject. But anyway, there was a sense that marriage, as much as it is about like love, for a person, yes, and a commitment, but that marriage was also a duty, that there was a social kind of component to marriage. Like for us, it's very intimate, very personal, just about me and this other person. But it used to be that people saw marriage as something as a part of like a social construct, that there's a duty element to it. And even the idea of the Levirate marriage is that idea that if your husband, if a woman's husband dies, a brother was supposed to, marry. That's called Levirate marriage. Even that, it's seeing this duty of the brother to perpetuate his brother's house and marry this woman. In other words, marriage and duty, they're not necessarily opposite and opposing ideas. Right? We're just so used to seeing marriage as just about like my feelings and things, but it's not the case. Marriage and duty, they could very much be in unity with each other. And actually, we see that sort of idea all over Scripture. Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. Duty and conviction and feelings, they all come into play when we make choices. But it's not like just because something is my duty, it's also something I don't feel good or happy about. It's very difficult, I think, for us as 21st century American Western thinkers to think that way about your marriage, as if it's something more than just your commitment to another person. It's at least that, but it is more than that too. It's a part of a society and culture. And a whole thing I was going to tangent on here, but I won't. But there's a big problem with some of even like the framing of our entertainment, which says everything is about feelings, but not about duty. And it always puts them at odds with each other, whereas the Bible always sees them as coming together. Anyway, in other words, Ruth here is asking for marriage not only because it blesses her, or she likes Boaz, or she fancies the idea of being his wife and being protected and cared for by him, but to say that he's a redeemer, she is showing that she's thinking of other people. Even when she's thinking about her own marriage. She's thinking about preserving and protecting Naomi's house and name. She's thinking about her dead husband. She's thinking about God as well. God is the one who provided this opportunity for Boaz to be a redeemer. So her thoughts are not just about marriage, which I'm sure she'd be happy to marry Boaz, but her thoughts are much bigger than that too. And so she's appealing to Boaz convictionally, not just emotionally. But they're not mutually exclusive. To feel strongly, but also have a conviction about the duty. Does that kind of track? I mean, I think we have to say that. We want to say that when we see this. Now, Boaz gets it. That's his understanding of what's going on. Because after he blesses her, he says that this last kindness is greater than the first. The first act of kindness being Ruth's act of devotion to her mother-in-law, Naomi. This act of devotion and commitment to Naomi and her God and her people, that was a great act. But now for her to do this thing, to consider him as a redeemer, potential redeemer for her family, it is something that he sees and acknowledges in her as a worthy thing. He knows that this is not less than an act of commitment and conviction, even as it is the case that it's more than that she does really love Boaz and would love to be his wife. The reference to not going after young men, whether rich or poor, is a compliment to Ruth, because it's saying exactly that rather than be led by just lust or passion, I'm going to find myself a strapping young lad, she was being wise and self-controlled and chaste, that she didn't just run off of what made her feel good. This is a compliment. You didn't just go. You could have gone after just some young guy and ruined your life, right? Making some silly choices, unwise, foolish choices, as can happen when you're a widow and you sort of get desperate or whatever the case might be. Now, it also seems like that Boaz might be older than Ruth, or much older, since he calls her my daughter. But Ruth probably here, people got married younger back then. Ruth herself was perhaps in her 20s or so. Maybe early 30s. She was married to her husband for several years. Remember, Naomi was in Moab for 10 years. So, did her sons get married right away? Was Ruth married right away to the family? At most then 10 years, but, if it's even just 7 or 8, and if she got married in her late teens, which is entirely, possible and customary, she would be in maybe her mid-20s or late 20s or so. Boaz then could have been in his 40s, and called Ruth his daughter, and is just referring to the fact that there is that age gap. It might have been, just sort of like an endearing term of family, because she's asking to be redeemed as a family member. So maybe it's less about age and more like a relational thing. We don't know any of the ages. It's not necessarily that big a deal if there is an age gap from 40s to 20s. But again, it's sort of odd, because why is he not married at 40? That would have been very unusual for that culture. So we don't know the age, doesn't necessarily matter. He's young enough to do this hard work of winnowing, which you wouldn't expect, say, a very old man to do. So he couldn't have been very, very much older than me, because I don't think I could do it. My back hurts just thinking about it. So younger than 44. Anyway, Boaz agrees. He does agree to the plan. He gets it. Not just because it helps her, but he says, all the townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And he knows that too. He already said that before. So he very much, I think, is enamored of her, rightfully so, because he's a quality guy. And he knows that this woman is also a quality woman. Ruth is truly, she's a wonderful person with a wonderful reputation. He knows that she is someone special. He knows that he should not let this person go. But there is a problem. Drama. You got to have drama. There is another redeemer closer. And so he would not be a worthy man if he were not someone to bring up a situation that might harm him, but reflected the truth or the proper law or legality regarding this. He knows it would be wrong to take this opportunity from someone else, even if that person is ignorant to what he has. Like, this other person doesn't even know that this opportunity is here. And this is how I think also we know that Ruth also really loved Boaz and was choosing him, because Naomi no doubt knew that this other guy was a redeemer and was closer. Ruth probably knew as well, but they didn't want to pursue this closer relation. Maybe he was not, and you don't necessarily read that he's a scummy guy or anything per se. You just know Boaz is a really good guy. So they didn't go after this closer relative who was available because they realized or they knew that Boaz is a good guy. He's a worthy guy. So I think this is just another way that we know this isn't just like Boaz is interchangeable with someone else. He's just looking for someone to redeem her. No, there was a real relationship, a real love here. And so you, again, just see these are good, solid people. They're good Christians, right? Doing the right thing, even when no one is looking. Even if they could totally take the advantage here, and who's going to be the wiser or anything like that? No, he says we have to do the right thing and let this person, this other relative, know who's closer, and so is kind of first in line to redeem Naomi and Ruth. After laying out this plan regarding the other redeemer, what happens next? Well, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Wise. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So she stays there with Boaz until just before it gets bright enough to see. Now, of course, some see this as, again, maybe some scandalous thing that she would stay there. But again, it's just clear that the opposite happened. The text has made it clear so many times that these are 2 worthy, honorable, God-fearing people who are not the type to dishonor and disobey the Lord, nor dishonor each other. I imagine, actually, is that they probably didn't sleep, but they just stayed up to talk. I don't know how they could have slept with the excitement and maybe the tension, what's going to happen with this guy tomorrow. It's just said they lied down. It doesn't necessarily say that they slept. So I don't know, they could have stayed up all night and just chatting and talking the night away. It's only in these I thought I was cynical, but people just will read this and just read all kinds of manipulations and salaciousness into it. I can fully imagine either the excitement made them both, tired, and Boaz especially with having winnowed the grain, or they just stayed up, just there, chatting the night away. In any case, nothing bad happened, and Boaz makes the wise choice to, in a way, ingratiate himself with a gift to the mother-in-law. Now, he's been doing it already, you can imagine. But this is, again, the wisdom of Boaz is to treat your in-laws, your potential in-laws, very nicely. But they don't know what's going to happen next. We know what's going to happen, but we'll see and get into that next week, Lord willing. Oh, no, next week we'll have our prayer time, by the way. So next week, come, do something a little different. We'll have corporate prayer together. So we won't find out next week. Lord willing, find out the week after with the end of Ruth. What do we glean from these verses? What can we learn? Well, I think I pointed out a few things along the way, but I really like this idea of this aggressive submission, of this very assertive humility. I like that idea. One commentator says, divine providence does not eliminate human activity. How do we translate to action? So I've got 3, right? 3 ways to be active even while divine providence is at work. And the first one is to take the humble initiative. To take the humble initiative, like Naomi did, like Ruth did. Being patient doesn't mean being passive. But it's amazing that she found, like, again, the most aggressively humble and submissive way to say, hey, let's get married. It's just, but there was no kind of sweeter, more tender, more wise way to have accomplished that goal than what Ruth did in lying at the feet of Boaz that night, perhaps the last opportunity to say or do anything in a kind of natural context without seeming like she's like taking, the responsibility to lead away from her, from Boaz, not her husband yet, but from Boaz. So taking the humble initiative, like you can take the initiative in a way that is not being a jerk or aggressive. And that, I think, could play out in homes, of course, and marriages, but even in workplaces when you need to talk to your boss about something, a real problem, or you need to talk to your pastor about something. You can take the humble initiative. You can bring it up in a way that is not trying to, come off like you're taking over the church. And many of you do that and are very gracious in doing that. Secondly, right, take the humble initiative. Secondly, first, take the humble initiative. Secondly, take the outcome with humility. You might not always get the answer you want. In this case, it's, yes, I would love to marry you, but there's this other guy. There's another redeemer. So I don't think they were necessarily expecting that. But when you do take the initiative, even as humble as you might be, you don't know what the outcome will be. So take that with humility as well, not necessarily expecting anything, but understanding that God's got a plan that he's unfolding, even if you don't know exactly what is going to happen next. Lastly, trust the Lord. And that's very basic, isn't it? But after you've done that, after you have humbly taken the initiative to do something, to address an issue or a problem, to try and resolve or tackle a situation as best you can, with all the humility you can muster, and then you're going to accept whatever outcome is going to happen with humility. It wasn't what you wanted. It wasn't exactly as you expected. And you say, you know what? That's okay. I don't have to always get my way. Of course, what's left? You trust. You just trust the Lord. He is going to work these things out. He is going to make things right and good in his time. He makes everything beautiful in his time, doesn't he? So you trust him. You trust him that maybe even if it doesn't make sense on this side of heaven, you will one day see that this is a story. Maybe not. I think one of the things that happened with Naomi, and she took these steps too, by the way. You can see how she took these steps. I think in that switch from the end of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 2, I think what she realized was that this wasn't just her story, but it was the story of her daughter-in-law as well. That if she just focused on her, the Lord took everything from me. I went full and I came back empty, right? God took away my husband and took away my sons. I think what she realized is this is not just my story, but a story about Ruth. And she started getting invested in Ruth's story and what God was doing in Ruth. And she didn't know it, but in trusting God and not just being concerned about what was happening to her, she was in another story as well. She was in a story about a king, David. And in fact, Naomi was in a story about the King of Kings, Jesus. Now, she didn't know all that at this time, and you may not. The point of trusting the Lord, that being the last step, is that you may not know or see how this is all unfolding to glorify Jesus, but there will come a day when you will, and it will have made everything worth it. When you see how all the sufferings and trials you went through, how the times when you did everything as humbly as possible and it still blew up in your face, still worked towards Christ's glory and your good. And you will, I think Naomi will stood in heaven when she came to God and seeing how history was going to unfold and how her loving Ruth resulted in Jesus being born. Easily said that was absolutely worth all the pain and suffering. But she knew that now. She trusted Lord enough that that promise of the future being like that reassured her in the present. Trusting Lord, that's what it really means. It's not just like, I believe this is going to work out. It's being so sure that there is going to be a last day when things will be made right. The sureness of that now changes you and makes you able to endure the hardship, makes you able to say, this is nothing. I can handle this because I'm so sure of that day. It comes back and it speaks to this day. That's what trusting the Lord is. It's not just a flippant, yeah, I think these things are going to work out, karma or whatever. No, it's the sureness. Trusting the Lord is the sureness that these things will work out, that there's something good and glorious can happen, just as this results in those last words of the book about Jesse fathering David, and then knowing that David is going to be the one by whom the Messiah would come. Now, to Christian, today, you are still part of a story, but it's a story that does not end well if you continue on the path that you are on, because all paths that are apart from God here and now will end apart from God in the life to come, where there's judgment and gloom for all those who turn away from him. But this Messiah, who came through the family of Naomi and Ruth, through a Moabite, through a widow, is exactly the kind of God that sees widows and those suffering, who's calling out to you to repent and trust in him and offers salvation. If you are a Christian, this afternoon, I just hope that something of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz's example might resonate with you, might carry you through this week, might give you some hope or some ability to trust in the Lord better or give a perspective on your situation. But deliberately ask the Lord, help me, Lord, to apply some of these things that I heard on Sunday to my life this week. I promise you, he will. He will, absolutely, he will. Ask him, though. Ask him, Lord, show me how I can apply these things to my life this week. He will absolutely answer that prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you again for loving us. Thank you again for your word. Thank you again for these women, Ruth and Naomi, their example of a heart that was willing to trust you, that knew that while there might be love and feelings, there's also duty and commitment and conviction. Thank you for the worthiness of Ruth and Boaz, just lighting a path for many a relationship, many a friendship, many a marriage. And we ask that we would humbly accept that example. And Lord, help us to apply these things in some way to our lives this week. And pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well,